introduce Brigitte Stenhouse, who is now at the, well, she's actually here in Cambridge now, but she is at the Open University. And she's going to be communicating mathematics through the household in Regency Britain.
Thanks, June. Yeah, a lesson I learnt today is don't agree to give a talk on the day you move out. So it might be slightly chaotic, but this is very much a work in progress. And so the kind of idea of looking at households in Regency Britain very much started from my work on Mary Somerville, who I'll speak a little bit about today, and looking at how she was able to access scientific communities, and especially how she was able to study and learn mathematics, very much at a time before women were formally educated. And a person who ended up playing a key role in that was her husband, Mr. Mary Somerville. And out of that project led to a really lovely collaboration with David Dunning. And I just want to quote here from something that David wrote in our joint introduction to this special issue that he mentioned yesterday. So David wrote, "We might say simply that what human beings ultimately try to construct are lives. For those who make family and mathematics important strands of their lives, those strands inevitably become entwined. How one does maths and how one practices domesticity are never independent vectors." And that's very much the kind of ethos of this talk, of trying to meet people where they are and think a bit more broadly about where maths is happening and how it is happening. And as I said, it's still in a very formative stage, which means I both feel very vulnerable, but also don't assume that I've read anything that you think, wow, that would be really helpful for her to read. Instead, email me and tell me what it is you think I should read, and I will be very, very grateful. So yeah, a little bit about Mary Somerville. I should also say, thinking back, I've very rarely given talks on the last day of conferences, which is like a weird sort of privilege to have, because once you've given your talk, you get to be a little bit happier. But what it has meant this week is that during almost every talk, I've been really actively relating it back to this, and it has been a really nice experience. And so hopefully there'll be some Easter eggs through the talk. One of the things is I really enjoyed Jenny's talk, which mentioned Howie quite a lot, because he is someone that Somerville very much followed in her interest with mineralogy. So just briefly, Somerville was alive 1780 to 1872. She grew up in Scotland near Edinburgh, but she starts to really make an impact in the archival record in around 1810, especially in 1812 when she gets married to William Somerville, who had been an army physician. He was already he was already well established. He'd been to South Africa. He was someone who'd done a lot of exploration in South Africa, and had written about his travels, though he hadn't published it. When they got married, they moved down to London, and William Somerville took off. He was a member of the Royal Society, the Linnean Society, the Geological Society. He was one of the co-founders of the Athenaeum Club. He was a proprietor of the Royal Institution. He was part of really questionable dining clubs like the Beefsteak Club, the Pow Wow Club, all these things that I should know more about than I do. And obviously this throws up huge contrast to his wife, Mary Somerville. She was the one who was already known as a mathematician. We have letters of introduction that already describe her as very accomplished, very intelligent. John Playfair, for slightly political reasons, says she has knowledge in mathematics that's rarely to be met with in men. William Somerville likes minerals. That's it. That's all he aspired to do. He enjoyed science. It was very much part of his social life, rather than, there doesn't seem to have been any aspiration to take that any further. And for example, on his Royal Society certificate of election, it acknowledges his acquirements rather than any sort of developments that he had made. But for him, that was kind of enough to get access to all these homosocial spaces. And so while it was really interesting in the Mr. Mary Somerville paper to think about how all of these memberships of William Somerville would have supported Mary Somerville in her studies and in her writing, it kind of still left a bit of a gap. And that gap can be very much filled by looking at her personal recollections. So this was an autobiography that she wrote. She started writing it in the 1860s, so when she was in her 80s, and it was published a year after her death, after having been slightly edited by Frances Cobb and her daughter Martha Charters Somerville. And within her personal recollections, the stories really come out of just how much Somerville's engagement in polite society in London was how she met people, forged these personal connections. And it's not that everything was mediated through William. She had these personal connections herself, just rather than being made at the Beefsteak Club, they were made in drawing rooms, either her own or other people's. And so this is a really lovely story. She says, Dr. Somerville and I used frequently to spend the evening with Captain and Mrs. Cater. Dr. Wollaston, Dr. Young, and others were generally of the party. Sometimes we had music, for Captain and Mrs. Cater sang very prettily. All kinds of scientific subjects were discussed, experiments tried, and astronomical observations made in a little garden in front of the house. One evening we had been trying the power of a telescope in separating double stars till about 2 in the morning. It's just what they do. And I should mention that Hattie Lloyd's PhD dissertation on the Royal Institution has been really formative for my thinking and sort of thinking about science and its place in polite society and being fashionable. Another really nice story, which rather than coming from Somerville's autobiography, comes from that of Charles Caldwell, edited by Harriet Warner. And in this, Charles Caldwell says, Charles Caldwell is an American physician. He's come to visit London. He has a letter of introduction to William Somerville, and Mary Somerville is also at home. And so this is him talking to her. Perceiving in a neat rosewood bookcase, the door of which was slightly open, a few volumes on botany, ornithology, and zoology, I changed the subjects of conversation to those branches of science, and found Mary Somerville in them but little, if at all, inferior. I changed again to geology and mineralogy, and found her, in the knowledge of the latter, decidedly my superior. A volume of Laplace, which caught my eye, directed my mind for a moment to the science of astronomy, respecting which she conversed with such a familiarity and compass of knowledge as might have led to a belief that she had just returned from a tour among the heavenly bodies. So I really love the kind of journey that Caldwell goes on to being like, she wasn't that dumb, to, oh no, she's way smarter than I am, or like way more well-versed in these topics of conversation. Also, it's not unusual that he didn't know who she was, being from very far away, and also he was there to visit William Somerville as a fellow physician. And so we kind of go on that journey with him of discovering just like, he kind of slowly realizes who it is that he is talking to. Yes, so that, and I kind of realized as I was making these slides that the title of the slide doesn't have the symmetry that I wish it did. So those two stories that I've just, or kind of extracts that I've just shared, very much give us an idea of the science that was happening in polite society, being part of polite conversation, just part of the interactions that people were having, not in aid of science, just because to seem, I guess, clubbable, as June would say. You have to know your stuff. And then the inverse, I really want to focus on what role this sort of polite society is playing in science. What role is it playing in connecting people, moving information, creating new information? So for example, this is a letter from Henry Holland to Somerville, where he says, "My dear Mrs. Somerville, I write a few lines in more distinct reference to some of the points I was obliged to hurry over yesterday." And I should say this letter is about 3 pages long, and covers many, many different topics. One of which, the memoir on the tails of comets that he'd clearly mentioned the day before, is by Professor Lohmann. I think you will find an account of it in one of the 2 Edinburgh Journals of Science about 2 years back. There is a cunning misinterpretation of Poisson about the magnetic power of the Earth. And so here we get a really nice hint, because obviously no one was recording these conversations that were happening in person. So it's really nice when you get a letter that explicitly acknowledges the areas that people were thinking about at that time, and also kind of the books and the places that he was recommending to Somerville to follow up on those discussions. One thing that I really, really want to hammer home is that this is not Mary Somerville being condescended to. She is not reliant on these networks because she's a woman. She's tapping into networks that already existed and were already used. And also, she wasn't just seen as a drain, she was also very much seen as a resource within this network. So for example, John William Lubbock writes to her saying, "I send you another letter which I have received from Monsieur Poisson, thinking you may like to peruse it. I also take the liberty of requesting you to accept 2 papers of mine. I particularly wish not to part with Poisson's letter." And so Lubbock very often, from what we have in the archival record, on multiple occasions sent Somerville his work and asked for her comments on either his calculations, on the notation that he was using, or just for her general feedback, especially for his work on lunar theory. And I included this just because sometimes it's really hard to read letters, and we are not alone, because Somerville replied to Lubbock saying, "I really hope when we meet that you will have the kindness to decipher the Baron Poisson's most unintelligible handwriting. It is quite tantalizing to have such letters in my possession without being able to profit by their contents." And I spoke to Jesper yesterday, who suggested I ask Bruno Belhost for help, because I think she also did not give back the Poisson letter because it's still in her archive. So many layers here. So yeah, I will take some water and then make some reflections. One of the things that has been my absolute pleasure to have in the past 4 months is very constant chats with Meg about women in science. And it's just honestly been an absolute joy, and has kind of reinforced some things, and we've been able to chat about kind of methodologically, how do we write a history of women in science that isn't just writing individual women back into stories that have already been told. And I guess part of this project is really trying to look at this social milieu that Mary Somerville was a part of, and that we have incredible resources for, and kind of meet these people where they are. And what I'll do next is just go through some of the people that we do meet from this perspective. But one of the things I'm very much fighting against is things like Lubbock's interactions with key individuals will also highlight just how small the world of metropolitan science was. Science in the 1830s, we will discover repeatedly, was largely organized by a small number of men meeting almost invariably at Somerset House. And it is so easy to give a talk in history of maths and not mention a single woman. It's just very easy to do, it's very common. And it just is sometimes frustrating that it's almost impossible to do the same for a woman in maths. You have to talk about how she accessed information, and so often that's mediated through the men that she knew, or the male institutions that she didn't have access to, but kind of found a way in. And so even that is still positioning these sort of male institutions, or exclusionary institutions, as being the most important, the central, and women are still on the periphery. And so trying to find a space where we can write about them as just being a natural part. And as we'll see, I'm not trying to argue that men and women engaged in science and polite society in exactly the same way or on equal footing, but it is just a space where we more naturally can see that although metropolitan science was a very small group of very socially elite people, it was not just a small number of men. And I should also say that I really enjoyed the Fullick thesis. This was just a really useful quote to use, and is not, I'm not meaning to besmirch the thesis in general. It was really, really useful to read. And I should say his thesis is a biography of John William Lubbock, which is kind of interesting, took that long to exist, because he's a cool guy. So go find out more about him. So a few women that we meet through the archive and the biography of Mary Somerville. I will just briefly say a little bit about the archive that we have. So it's Somerville's papers are all at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. There's thousands of letters. I'd say maybe around 700, 800 of them are scientific correspondence, maybe a little bit more. And so we really meet so many characters that she was writing to, although mostly being written to, because obviously this is her collection of letters that she collected through her life. So arguably the person it tells you that you get the voice of the least is Mary Somerville. You get everybody else's voice in that archive. And so again, it's one of those things methodologically of previously the archive has almost exclusively been used to say things about Mary Somerville, when in fact it is just generally a really good resource for history of Regency science, like in general, and doesn't have to be just a woman and telling an individual woman's story. It tells you so much more than that. And which is why it's really great that a lot of the metadata of those letters is now up on the Epsilon project website, so you can kind of see them embedded within wider correspondence, especially those of like Faraday and Herschel, who were very much her contemporaries. And so yeah, it's a great resource, which I encourage people to use to say things about people other than Mary Somerville. So some women. I've just pulled out some brief mentions that we get of the scientific women that Somerville interacted with and explicitly mentioned in her autobiography. So firstly, she took lessons in mineralogy from Mrs. Lowry, who she describes as a Jew or a Jewess, the wife of an eminent line engraver who had a large collection of minerals. Madame Biot, so this is Gabrielle Biot, was a well-educated woman and had made a translation from the German of a work which was published under the name of her husband. So that's all the information we get in the autobiography, but that it was in fact a translation of Fischer's work on mechanics from German into French. She goes on to say, later, Sir Edward Sabine married a lady of talent and scientific acquirements. She translated Cosmos from the German and assisted and calculated for her husband in his laborious work. So that it has been quite a lot written about the role of women in scientific translation. For more on that, I would encourage you to look at the bibliography of the Calculating Couples special issue. I cannot offer you that off the top of my head. Apologies. And finally, Somerville, of course, mentions Charlotte Murchison. And I really like how she describes her husband. So she says, our great geologist, Sir Roderick Murchison, with his wife, were among the English residents at Rome when the Somervilles were visiting. At that time, he hardly knew one stone from another. Lady Murchison, an amiable and accomplished woman with solid acquirements which few ladies at that time possessed, had taken to the study of geology, and soon after her husband began that career which has rendered him the first geologist of our country. It was then that a friendship began between them and us, which will only end with life. So that's a snapshot of the women that we meet in Somerville's autobiography. I should say, between the autobiography and the letters, I'm slowly building up a very badly formatted Excel spreadsheet, which at the moment has about 32 families, where we have very brief mentions of women taking part, or kind of it not just being an individual, but science being part of a household endeavor. And here I want to acknowledge the thing that Gemma brought up about eccentric biographies. I'd not heard that before, and I really liked that concept, which I will look into further, because this is very much, we get like little hints and little teasers of these people, but it's really hard to find more information about them. And so this idea of bringing everything together, and rather than just writing one person in at a time, this idea of kind of bringing together a collection of eccentric biographies, I found really compelling. One person that Somerville mentions as just being a best friend rather than any scientific acquirement is the wife of Thomas Young, and that's Eliza Young. And so although Somerville doesn't mention Eliza Young's nous, there is a really nice passage in Peacock's Life of Thomas Young, which goes as follows. I think this is Peacock had visited Thomas Young. There was a heated discussion, and so Mrs. Young was present at it, the heated discussion, without offering to take any part in it, as the fear of being designated by the ridicule implied in the sobriquet of bas bleu, blue-stocking, makes English ladies reserved in the presence of strangers. Our neglect of propriety never struck us until the moment when Mrs. Young quitted the room somewhat precipitately. We were beginning to make our apologies to her husband when we saw her return with an enormous quarto under her arm. It was the first volume of the Treatise on Natural Philosophy. She placed it on the table, opened the book, and without saying a word, at page 387, showed with her finger a figure where the curvilinear course of she basically solved the argument. The curvilinear course of the diffracted bands, which were the subject of the discussion, was found to be established theoretically. And so, again, it's just a little hint, a little tease, but she obviously knew this treatise well enough that Anne could follow the discussion, and even if she was a silent part of that discussion, she found a way to become active in it by going and finding that text and placing it on the table and being like, I don't know why you guys are fighting, the answer is here. And yeah, I really, really love the kind of image that this pulls up. And it also opens this question of, okay, how, like, is this because she was, Thomas Young was part of this Somerville milieu of people who were constantly visiting each other, having these, it was expected that conversation would take a scientific turn, and so it's likely that Eliza Young was there. And so how much of this was osmosed through just being part of these polite dinner conversations? How much was it active searching for more information? Currently, no way to find out that, but maybe one day. I just wanted to briefly talk about this set of rooms in Trinity College in Cambridge, which unfortunately, through severe disorganization, I did not manage to get inside, but managed to go and look at the outside of. The reason this is exciting is because in 1832, Mary Somerville came to visit Cambridge. She was invited by Adam Sedgwick and in fact was hosted at Trinity College here in Cambridge and stayed in those rooms. The letters from Sedgwick to both the Somervilles, he writes to both Mary and William in the preparation for this trip, really highlight again just kind of that Somerville was seen as an active member of a scientific community, not just like good chat or a good mate. He specifically says that this set of rooms has a mathematical library attached to it. They were the rooms that belonged to the astronomer Richard Sheepshanks. And he says that the rooms have a mathematical library where Somerville can ensconce herself when she's tired of duller subjects. So when she's done with the people that she's hanging out with, she can retire to this mathematical library. And he sees her as a legitimate person who could make use of this library, who would value this library. It's not wasted on her. And so I think that's a really nice perspective. Something else that comes out in that letter is actually that Somerville was not the first woman to stay in this set of rooms. Apparently they'd already been tested out by Roderick and Charlotte Murchison, the geologists, a few months earlier. And so this wasn't necessarily a one-off situation, much as that did seem to be relatively shocking to the archivist at Trinity College, because there were rules against women staying in college. So while it was an exception, it wasn't a unique exception. To find out more about what the Somervilles were doing while they were in Cambridge, we can turn to the memoir or the letters of William Whewell, in which, so these were edited and published in 1881. And so here Whewell's written, among other things, I have been occupied during the last week with a very remarkable lady, Mrs. Somerville, who is one of the best mathematicians in England and has recently published a book called The Mechanism of the Heavens, one of the most profound works that has yet appeared on the subject of the Newtonian philosophy of the universe. What makes this still more remarkable is that Mrs. Somerville is a very feminine, gentle, and lively person. She possesses in a very great degree all the usual accomplishments of ladies, such as music, drawing, and various languages. She herself educates her daughters, and there are no girls better taught. Obviously, this quote shows us that there is still this panic that being too scientific will render you unladylike or unwomanly, but Mary Somerville has managed to walk that line. But also this kind of the air of celebration that Whewell has when he's writing about Somerville, one of the best mathematicians in England. And as he says, she just recently published Mechanism of the Heavens, which was nominally a translation of Laplace's Mécanique Céleste into English. It was a partial translation, and she did change the text relatively substantially during that translation process. And we have another quote saying that in this this visit to Trinity College, Somerville had publicly taken her place in science at that time. Something interesting to note is that her son had actually just graduated from Trinity College a few years earlier. So her son, Vorontsov Grieg, was a son from a first marriage, and he will come up a little bit later. And in some of the letters that are held in Trinity College and have actually been digitized, is really sweet. Somerville, when she's writing to Whewell, and kind of the fact that Mechanism of the Heavens is in the library there and is being used in teaching there, she says she's really glad for it to be of use to our college, which is, so she kind of either is staking a claim there or genuinely feels like she has been welcomed to Trinity College. And although she would absolutely never have been able to study there or like even dream of taking the tri-pass examination, she still, in her own way, has found a way for it to become our college or her college. Another perspective on this week comes from William Rowan Hamilton, the Irish mathematician, who was visiting for basically the exact same time. And he says, the consequence was that we lived for that week in a continual round of engagements and found Cambridge so gay that Airy, who hates ladies' parties, complains that we shall have gone away with quite a false and unjust notion of the university. To correct this notion a little, he dined with us in Hall on Sunday last. So again, we still get this very, much as Somerville was able to find a way to visit Trinity, feel like it was our college, she absolutely did not dine in Hall. The kind of way that Somerville was hosted was this round of dinner parties rather than kind of being fully welcomed in. And it's arguable whether Hamilton gained anything from this dining in Hall that Somerville wasn't able to gain in her own way, but we do see that there are still these differences. And I think Meg sent me at one point a quote from Airy about this week where he was not a fan. One of the things that I hope, even though I haven't explained very explicitly or clearly, but I hope was clear, is that with this project, I'm very much trying to move away from just collaborative couples to looking at families a little bit more broadly and how extended networks or extended households can constitute a space for scientific research and kind of the building of scientific networks. And so here we have letters from Somerville to William Whewell. The first one is just in Paris. So she was visiting Paris for a few months, and it sounds like he had sent her with a copy of his report on mineralogy to give out while she was there. So she herself is carrying out some little commissions and jobs for Whewell to kind of forward this communication of scientific knowledge. But he also gave her commissions for her first husband's cousin, Alexei Grieg, who was in the Russian Navy. And so Whewell very much wanted tide observations to be made in areas in Russia. And he says, nobody knows better than you do how much remains to be done respecting the tides and what important results any advance in that subject would have. I hope through your Russian friends you may have the means of bringing this memorandum to the notice of the administration of their navy. And so it's not just Somerville herself who is who can be helpful. It's also the fact that she has these connections with the Russian Navy, and indeed through other family members as well. So again, William Smythe also requested Somerville to use her connections to Admiral Grieg to take observations of the moon culminating stars over the meridian. With William Smythe, we get this working in the other direction, because Smythe very much collaborated very frequently with his wife Annarella. And so in the Smythe-Somerville correspondence, there's letters that kind of go between both William Smythe and Annarella. And one really lovely letter, Annarella specifically writes because William's unwell, but neither of them wanted Somerville to wait too long for the information that she'd requested. And so through Annarella, they recommend books that Somerville needs while she's writing, as well as passing on just concrete data that had been collected at their observatory at home in Bedford. It was necessary in this talk to have a reference to Pride and Prejudice, and so I would say it is a truth rarely acknowledged that a scientific man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife. And so one really lovely quote from Somerville's autobiography about Professor Leslie, who is based in Edinburgh. She says, "Leslie was always falling in love, and to Dr. Somerville's inexpressible amusement, he made me his decoy duck, inviting me to see some experiments which he performed dexterously, at the same time telling me to bring as many young ladies as I chose, especially Miss Blank, for he was sure she had a turn for science. He was unfortunate in his aspirations and remained a bachelor to the end of his life." And so it's not just that he wants a wife. She has specifically acknowledged here that he wanted a wife, ideally with a turn for science. And so it's not just kind of reading back into this and acknowledging that, oh, quite a few kind of scientists also happened to have scientific wives. What a funny coincidence. I wonder how that happened. But also looking into agency and how people, both men and women, chose to build a life, and kind of harking back to that quote from the very first slide from David Dunning, choosing to get married and who to get married, as much as it was and could be a choice, very much would shape the rest of your life. And if you were interested in science, if you're a man, finding a wealthy woman is a very good shout. And if you're a woman, finding a scientific man whose work you can collaborate on also seems to have been a good shout. And even, so there's the Matilda effect, that a lot of women's work often gets subsumed under the sort of name of a male either collaborator or family member who they collaborated with. And indeed, Charles Lyell, the geologist, already in 1835, recognized that this happened. So he wrote in 1835, "Had our friend Mrs. Somerville been married to Laplace or some mathematician, we should never have heard of her work. She would have merged it in her husband's and passed it off as his. Not so Madame de Stael, she would have been a jealous rival." Again, throwing up this kind of, it's okay for that Somerville is scientific because she's still a good woman. She's still modest. She's not a rival. And so doing that through this comparison to Steele. Lyle goes on to say, a man may desire fame, reputation, and even glory for the sake of sharing it with one he loves. A woman cannot share it with her husband. It will be the utmost she can do to not make him of less importance by it. Who would like to guess who he's writing to? His fiancée! So it's very much, I don't know, I would say that this is what you can expect from this marriage. Like, you can pursue science, and Mary Horner Lyell, it has been acknowledged that she was sort of involved in Charles's geological work, went on geological expeditions with him. But in this letter, it's kind of saying this is what you can expect from this marriage. Like, you can be involved, but I'm the front guy. Like, you can't make me of less importance by your pursuits. And he goes on further to say, to reap the full benefit of what the Germans are doing and thinking would require no moderate intimacy with the tongue and its idioms. So here talking about work in geology and mineralogy being done in German. I am sure you will work at German with more zeal if you believe you can help me by it, as I labor with greater spirit now that I regard myself as employed for you as well as for myself. So I'm sure you want to help me in the background, and here's how you can. So a very fascinating letter to be sent to a fiance. Unclear, I mean, I don't know, I haven't looked into how much translation work Mary Lyell might have done for Charles Lyell, but I do know that quite a few years later, Somerville's daughters were asked by Lyell to translate a book from German into English, which just comes up in the life letters and journals of Charles Lyell. Something else that people might have noticed is a lot of these collected works of letters that I've mentioned have in fact been edited by women, often family members. So Charles Lyell's life and letters were edited by his sister-in-law, so both his wife's sister and his brother's wife. And then obviously Somerville's were edited by her daughter, and William Whewell's was edited by Janet Stair Douglas, who was his first wife's niece. And so a lot of this commemorative work is also being, of this scientific period, is being done by the female, mostly female, but also by the family members of the people who were involved. And these are just some photos of Mary Somerville's children's graves, because I don't have any images of her daughters. And thanks to June for getting those photos from the graveyard in Naples. So far, I've been very lax and flipping between, well, in fact, mostly just using science and not really talking about maths. Another thing about these households that I really want to pin down is they are interdisciplinary, and so trying to pin down where maths fits into that story is something that I'm really interested in, but have not yet embarked upon. But one person who very much was a mathematical contemporary of Somerville was Ada Lovelace. And so Lovelace was the same age as Somerville's daughters, and in fact married one of Somerville's son's friends. And Vorontsov Grieg, her son, kind of in some places takes credit for this match as well. And Somerville takes credit for the match between Charles Lyell and Mary Horner Lyell. She says they met in her house. And so you kind of see these connections between different families, which are strengthening both intellectual and social ties. And Mary Somerville takes a lot of credit for Ada Lovelace's education, which you can read the work of Chris Hollings and Ursula Martin and Adrian Rice to find out a bit more about her actual mathematical studies and how much Somerville may have been involved. But what Somerville did provide is certainly a mentor. She chaperoned Ada Lovelace to these Saturday soirees at Charles Babbage's house. where they kind of met lots of people, but also sourced some models for learning spherical geometry through William Ritchie at the Royal Institution. And sort of there is some brief letter correspondence where they discuss mathematics. I've chosen this extract both because it's my favorite quote from the Lovelace letters, but also because it says something interesting. So in 1836, Lovelace writes to Somerville, "I hope that your daughters will come here with their brother on Saturday next. He will, I suppose, be obliged to return to town on the Monday, but I trust they will remain some days. I promise to take care of them and to be a vigilant chaperone, informing you as soon as either one of them has eloped and is beyond reach." So I just love that quote. I think it really kind of conveys Ada Lovelace's character. She tells quite a few jokes in the letters, and she seems to have had quite a, I guess, dry sense of humor. But it also tells us a lot. So Somerville had two daughters that reached adulthood, and neither of them ever married. By 1836, it seems likely that Somerville, her and her husband had some financial dealings that went a bit awry. Their family also had debts and then either absconded and left the country or died, leaving Mary and William Somerville to pay those debts. So by this point, it's kind of widely said that they had lost the dowries for their daughters. And this kind of, the importance of them getting married comes up a few times. When Somerville, I think it's either on the publication of Mechanism of the Heavens or slightly later, Somerville's written to saying that now her daughters can look down upon dukes. They'll have like the pick of the lot on the marriage mart, which it never really comes to fruition. And it might be because of this lack of dowry. In fact, this kind of gave Somerville quite a lot of anxiety and really shaped the publications that she then went on to have. So after Mechanism of the Heavens in 1831, she then rewrote the book, keeping a lot of the material but removing basically all of the mathematical formulae in an attempt to make the work more popular. And she writes a lot about needing her works to sell really well. She in private, it seems quite clear that she needed to have an income, not a hugely substantial income, but she needed at least some income from these books. So she needed them to be popular. In her 90s, she prepares new editions of all of her books to be published, or most of her books, to be published after her death. And I think it's highly likely that she's doing that so that her two unmarried daughters would have an income when she dies. Because at that point, they're living off a pension that Somerville has, which will stop when Somerville dies. And so she would leave her two daughters without any income. And so it really does shape what Somerville is able to write and the markets that she's writing for. And so arguably, it might have been quite helpful had Ada Lovelace facilitated a nice elopement for one of the Somerville daughters to a fellow, because at this point, Lovelace is very much part of the aristocracy. So if an aristocrat could have eloped with one of the Somerville daughters, Somerville's mathematical output might in fact have been very different. Okay, we're at the end. This was briefly to say that, again, this question of where does mathematics fit, especially when you're looking at households where people will come with very different educational backgrounds, different access to university or indeed high school, different access to tutors, both through gender but also kind of economic background. And so how to understand what role mathematics is playing, and how to communicate mathematics in a space where not everyone will have the same mathematical background, and indeed they very rarely would have the same mathematical background. And I think there is definitely some sort of prestige element to mathematics, which I need to pin down, but this quote talks about the study of astronomy mathematically handled, not what they call astronomy at ladies' boarding schools. And so there's something kind of prestigious, well, obviously the mathematical treatment of astronomy was seen as the best thing that maths had achieved at that time. And so kind of figuring out how that information moves in these spaces. So just to conclude with this project, some questions that I'm currently asking myself as I try and turn this from a nebulous idea to enable me to read wonderful letters to a concrete research question. Why the Regency period? Obviously, there's really excellent resources for this period, both in the Herschel letters and the Somerville letters, and a few other places that I've already identified. But what about it? What about the Regency period will be a fruitful time period to look at? And the next two questions, I say I'm asking myself, they were actually provided by Nicola like 2 months ago. So thank you, Nicola, for these questions. What does maths bring to the history of the household? And what can we not answer in history of mathematics without the household? And so, yeah, my conclusions are, I'm not going to answer those three questions. Feel free to ask me them in the Q&A if you'd like. But anyway, so although the scientific institutions of the Regency period were almost exclusively for men, mixed gender socializing in homes and through letters played a vital role in circulating scientific knowledge, which I realize I have not given you concrete evidence of, but I can do that. Letters between households and extended families played a crucial role in circulating mathematical and scientific knowledge. And by shifting our perspectives towards the household, we don't need to write women into existing histories, but we can naturally include them from the start, which is something I'm really trying to do. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Brigitte. That was terrific. Frederic?
Yeah, thank you very much. I wondered, it made me think about the work of Isabelle Levenon and the role of household for women in the 18th century to access science education, because of course they were not accepted in schools and universities and so on. And so I wondered if there's any trace of Marie Somerville teaching her daughters.
Yes. I don't know how, like, she definitely taught her daughters. I'm not totally sure how much maths she taught her daughters. There is kind of one of the tales that comes through from a draft of her autobiography, but this passage was taken out but when it was published. Somerville actually had a third daughter who was older but died age 10. And Somerville basically says, oh no, I think I taught her too much maths. Like, she was too delicate, she died. So, like, if that's genuinely what she felt, and wouldn't have been a massively unusual thing to think at that time, I don't know if that put her off teaching maths to her, like, younger daughters in the same way. Certainly neither of her daughters, like, I haven't seen any evidence of them reading maths, studying maths, talking about maths. So far, most of the stuff from her daughters is botanical, collecting ferns. There's a really, really excellent letter where one of her daughters has gone to climb glaciers, and so Somerville writes to her saying, I don't think I'm comfortable with the only thing between you and death being a rope and a man. And it's so good. So yeah, they are, and as I said, they sort of translated this work for Charles Lyell from German. So they are, like, in that milieu, but I don't know how much maths they would have been. And to be honest, much as I hate to say it, maybe they just didn't like maths. Also a possibility. Thank you.
Nicola?
Regarding the specificity of mathematics with respect to oral stories of science in the household and science in first, I was wondering if there is something about you used also a term that Michael used, the difficulty or the hardness of mathematics. Because you may, without much effort, casually talk about some minerals and flowers at a very superficial level. But perhaps with mathematics, there's something where the entry cost is much higher in terms of training and fluency and mastery over symbols, over abstract notions. So perhaps is mathematics harder for people to use and as a means of evolving and navigating those spaces compared to other natural sciences?
my gut reaction is yes. And I guess, yeah. Yeah, and there's also the thing of, so one of the things with Somerville, I guess, is that she was emerging onto the scene at a time when there was a non-trivial group of people who were quite critical of the tripos and the training at Cambridge. And so she managed to fit into this little niche where she hadn't had access to that space, but that was okay, because what she'd had access to is wealthy people's homes who had French maths books, or people who'd like gifted her those books. I think Jim Secord says that a lot of the library that she had of mathematical books was purchased for her as a wedding present on her second marriage. And so that would have been a huge coup to like have those books herself. And yeah, that doesn't seem to have been an easily repeatable phenomenon for other women kind of in her circle. As yet, I don't have any evidence of women like trying and failing to engage with maths, if you see what I mean.
I was thinking, for instance, in Rob Ives' paper, I think called Butter and Parsnips. I mean, a play with butter and parsnip. I don't remember the exact title. In Newtonian contexts, he makes the case that mathematics circulates with more difficulty than other natural endeavors, and it's much harder for people to just casually discuss because
I mean, the lack of actual objects. I mean, if you've got an object, I mean, you can say something about it, even if you don't actually have the scientific knowledge. I think, isn't that, do you think that happens?
About math to be entertaining and socially.
Yeah, I mean, you can have some pretty crystals and flowers. Yeah.
I guess coming back to that as well, something that I really want to dig down into is just quite what it means for Somerville to have rewritten Mechanism of the Heavens into Connection of the Physical Sciences. And in a review of Connection, Bio specifically says, like, it's great that it's still, like, based mathematically, because to have removed that would have been to butcher the work. And so quite what it means for something entirely in prose, like obviously prose can be mathematical, but the focus on Connection of the Physical Sciences is sharing information about the physical sciences that has been deduced mathematically without explaining the mathematical like infrastructure behind that. And so something I would really like to look into is that process of taking knowledge in the physical sciences that was deducted mathematically and how that circulates, especially because there's a really nice quote in Connection, which was also in Mechanism, where Somerville specifically says, like, you will be able to appreciate astronomy from reading this, but only someone who's versed in the mathematics can truly appreciate, like, creation. And so even she kind of suggests that there's this hierarchy between the people who can understand the conclusions and the descriptions compared to the people who understand the mathematical framework that's kind of lurking in the background. Thank you for that question. I'll add that to the list of questions Nicola has asked me.
Can I ask you a couple? Well, one's a comment. I mean, about the daughters and their marriage. I mean, I wonder to what extent, the young bucks of the day might have felt a bit intimidated by their potential mother-in-law.
I mean, but I feel like other people were intimidated. They powered through.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Anyway, that's kind of slightly. But I mean, the other thing I wanted to ask you was, I mean, you mentioned Babbage's soirees, with which I'm kind of, familiar with. But then I thought, were other people having scientific soirees, rather than the dinner party, which is clearly, Babbage, it was a much bigger deal. It was very clearly it was meant to be scientific. I just wondered whether there were other people doing that at the time, and also whether that is sort of something that starts to play out a bit more when things like the British Association get going, and women go, and there are obviously things going on in connection with that. So I was just kind of interested about these more informal scientific spaces. I know you've sort of looked at some of those things.
For the life of me, I'm like 99% sure I have seen a description of someone else having a scientific soiree, but I cannot for the life of me think who it is, which could mean that it doesn't exist. But yeah, I guess I haven't come across any sort of formal, weird, like, calling it a soiree, but there are definitely multiple mentions of people inviting Somerville to a dinner party and saying things like, oh, we're going to invite these people, they'll come if you come, so like please come.
Right, yes,
and they're like specifically trying to create like a dinner party of scientific names. And certainly when Somerville goes to Paris, she says like Gabrielle Biot organized a dinner party with the distinguished people that like, because people, it wasn't just like a party for your mates. People thought about like who they're, I literally am getting that from lad to ladette. But anyway, like you would think about who was at your dinner party, you would think about who's going to be sat there, and you would want it to be like a good night that people have kind of gained something from. But yeah, I don't know if this, like, I haven't come across anyone else who did that regularly, but there are these mentions of sort of curated dinner parties in the letters.
Thank you. Dan?
Is there any evidence that in households like the Somervilles where women were allowed to sort of enter men's spaces, is there also sharing of domestic responsibilities? So, or is it still on the woman's part to take up all of those roles?
I mean, pretty much all of the households I've spoken about today would have had like servants. I think Somerville would have been responsible for that, although I think Somerville would have taken that on. There is like one conversation where when Somerville's in Paris and she's like writing back to William Somerville being like, go to this desk, get this book out, look on this page and tell me how much I owe the maid. Because the maid is gonna leave them in Paris, and so they need to like pay her wages, which apparently they had not been paying her for either 8 or 10 months. Somerville couldn't quite remember. And so they needed to like pay that. And obviously there's the follow-up question of, will you also send me money so that I can pay the maid? So yeah, it sounds like from that Somerville would have been in charge for that element. And certainly like any perspective that we have on looking after the children, which everything through the autobiography you have to think is curated, and was curated for a Victorian readership. So Somerville is very much positioned as being in charge of the daughters. There's a couple of things that I found about William Somerville which just make him seem like the most adorable little egg. I can't think of anything off the top of my head about stuff he did for the daughters.
Time for one more quick question. Anybody got a quick question? Ursula?
Well, this is, as I say, more of a comment. One of the ways in which you know it's been a good 4 months is you realise all these conversations you should have had with somebody while you were in the same place, and we could definitely have a very long conversation about Ada Lovelace. Interestingly, when she was already married, Ada Lovelace and her mum, rather than her husband, visited Cambridge and went to see Whewell, but they did not stay in Trinity because the address, the letter where she describes it to her husband has their address, which was down towards the station, which obviously didn't exist in England. So that's something to do with being chaperoned. You know, they couldn't possibly stay in Trinity, but even though she was Lady Lovelace, it's a whole social protocol.
I know we're in negative time, but was it Louisiana's paper where it mentions that Lovelace collaborated with her husband on that paper?
Oh, there's there's
later, but
ask the other Ada Lovelace file. Yes, there's and similarly the husband's playing a supporting role. There's a letter from Babbage setting up a meeting to talk about the paper, saying, I'll come over this afternoon and we can talk about the paper. Mr. Lovelace, or the Earl, or however he refers to him, is welcome to join us if he's not too afraid of the algebra.
Well, but I think on that note, I think we'll thank Brigitte again for a wonderful talk.